One of the most brutal and horrific periods in English history was ushered in by the Tudors. The Tudor dynasty sat on the throne for over a century, and there were scores of executions ordered by the kings and queens. It was during this time that King Henry VIII condemned two of his own wives inside of the Tower of London, and during his reign there were roughly 70,000 people executed all across England. Roughly 3% of the population lost their heads or were executed in other ways during just his 4 decades on the throne. Bloody Mary or Mary I also burned many people at the stake, as they believed a different form of religion to the Queen. It was Elizabeth I who became probably the greatest Tudor monarch of all, but the Queen had a rough side, and she even had some of her former favourites sent to the Tower to lose their heads after. In this documentary we will outline some of the most brutal executions of the Tudor period, from the execution of a Scottish Queen and rival to Elizabeth I's throne, to the close friend and advisor of Henry VIII who fell from grace and lost his head in a brutal botched execution. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. During the reign of Henry VIII, there were many executions which were very brutal. The king executed some of his closest friends and advisors, such as Sir Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell, and some of these are linked to the king's brutal side. He even executed 2 of his own wives, so was not afraid to order brutal killings to administer justice. But it was at Smithfield which became linked to some of the most savage executions of the time period, as many heretics or religious criminals were burned at the stake. It was there during the reign of Mary I, Henry's bloody daughter, who burned many people at the stake there, but it was also the site of an execution of a man who wasn't guilty of treason, but he was accused of poisoning some of his masters. In England, the fear of poisoning was prominent, especially with the upper classes, and some of the kings and queens even forced servants or employed specific food tasters to sample food and meals before the king and queen would tuck into their food. This was done to prevent poisoning, and as hygiene wasn't great also during the Tudor period, often cases of food poisoning in meals could be linked to deliberate poisoning, so food preparation was in a sense a very dangerous job. It was inside of the Bishop of Rochester, John Fisher's house, that an allegation of poisoning would take place. On the 18th of February 1531, Fisher was in his house having a meal with a number of his advisers and close attendants. It was said in an Act of Parliament what occurred that afternoon, and it was said, "On the 18th day of February 1531, one Richard Roose of Rochester, cook, also called Richard Cook, did cast poison into a vessel, full of yeast or balm, standing in the kitchen of the Bishop of Rochester's palace at Lambert March, by means of which 2 persons who happened to eat the pottage made from such yeast died." So what happened is that Richard Roose, a cook of Bishop John Fisher, was accused of poisoning yeast, and then 2 people who ate the food made by the yeast died. The 2 people who died were a gentleman named Bennet Curwen, and also a widower who accepted John Fisher's offer of food inside of his house, and her name was Alice Trippitt. However, the more sinister element of a possible poisoning plot put the real target as possibly John Fisher the bishop, as it would not have made any sense for someone to aim to kill those 2 people. But Fisher did not eat the porridge or the poisoned soup, and he was unharmed, as it's likely he was fasting during that meal. But more people became ill, and it was said that around 17 of Fisher's company had become violently sick, and many of the diners that evening were those who had been welcomed into his house for charity. With this, Fisher's reputation could have been very damaged, being linked to a plot to possibly poison the poor. But Fisher's brother Richard then immediately went after Richard Roose and tried to apprehend him and order his arrest, but Roose had already escaped from the bishop's palace. As he ran, it's likely this could have been an indicator of guilt, but then Roose was quickly caught and was then imprisoned inside the Tower of London. But the fear of poisoning after this incident went into overdrive and panic. Throughout many upper-class households in London, and also in the royal circles, there was mass hysteria and panic over food being poisoned. This fear even reached the King's royal court. When Roose was interrogated, it was not clear who had given Roose the poison to tarnish the food of John Fisher, but also with this there was suspicion as to whether Roose was linked to a larger plot, with some Protestants planning to kill or assassinate John Fisher. The bishop at the time was considered one of the greatest Catholic scholars in Europe, and he had a great amount of influence in England. This could have brought him into conflict with the king, especially as he would split from the Catholic Church and the Pope, and also decree himself the head of the Church of England. Henry VIII did possibly have a motive to carry out the assassination of John Fisher, as he had around this time started to try and find a way out of his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and he then tried to appeal to the Pope to grant him a divorce so he could marry Anne Boleyn. Bishop John Fisher ultimately would later go to his own execution for refusing to support the king in his marriage to Anne Boleyn, and his position as the supreme head of the Church of England. But John Fisher was considered one of the biggest problems in getting Henry his divorce or annulment, and Fisher could have gone against the king and supported the Pope. Fisher did do this, and he took Catherine of Aragon's side, and because of this he crossed the king. But Richard Roos, the cook, was inside the Tower of London, and was subject to some horrific punishment inside the notorious fortress. Roos was thrown onto the horrific torture device of the rack, and was subject to a huge amount of pain. He was put on the wooden frame, and his arms and limbs were then pulled under incredible strain, and the rack was a successful interrogation machine on Richard Roos. Whilst he was on the rack, he admitted to putting what he believed was simply a laxative into the yeast, and he claimed it was a certain poison or venom, and he then claimed he dropped this in as a joke into the porridge pot. Roos gave over no other names of possible co-conspirators, and he said that he knew that the white powder would cause some ill health or discomfort, but he claimed he did not realise it could be fatal, and he said he only put laxative in the food and nothing more. More suspicion would fall on Henry VIII and the family of his second wife Anne Boleyn, as Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador to England for the Holy Roman Emperor, would blame the English king and state he was guilty of organising the suspected poisoning. He claimed that Anne had written documents about how she wanted Fisher to die and how she hated him. But because of his confession in the Tower of London, Richard Roos was never tried and was never brought in front of a jury to defend himself. On the 28th of February 1531, Henry VIII told Parliament of the poisoning plot, and Roos was then condemned to die, based on what the king had said had happened, rather than any concrete evidence. The king's word was final, and he also expanded the definition of treason, saying that murder by poisoning would be classed as this. He also then tweaked the sentence of death, saying that this crime would be then punishable by boiling alive, and this is exactly what happened to Richard Roos. On the 5th of April 1531, in front of a huge crowd in Smithfield, Richard Roos was taken to his site of execution. He was subject to be boiled alive in a huge pot, and what the crowd saw that day would haunt them terribly. An account from the Tudor period, titled The Chronicle of the Grey Friars, said of Richard Roos' horrific death that he was tied up in chains and then placed in a metal gibbet frame, before he was then lowered in and out of the boiling water. This occurred 3 times until he was dead. Another account of Roos' death stated that he roared mightily loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead. Other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. There were very few executions that were as brutal as the boiling alive, as the blood-curdling screams would be heard all over Smithfield, and Roos was lowered into the boiling pot of water. It's likely that his skin disintegrated also, and the fact it took just 3 dunks into the pot to kill him showed how brutal the method of execution was. It is interesting to consider whether Henry VIII specifically organised Richard Roos' execution based on the fact he was a cook. There could have been some mocking in this, and that his execution could have been a rerun of his crime of poisoning, as Roos was symbolically the poison which was being lowered into the boiling soup. But it's also interesting to consider whether the king was covering his own tracks, and whether he knew of the poisoning plot. By denying a trial for Roos, it was the king's word that would sentence him to death, and he could have been doing this to cover his own tracks. However, the brutal King Henry VIII would later get his own way with Bishop John Fisher and sentence him to death, and he and Anne Boleyn would get what they wanted. Fisher was executed for refusing to accept Henry as the head of the church and favouring the Pope in this role. But Fisher would go to his death with dignity, unlike his cook, who was boiled alive in horrific fashion. England has a dark history involving executions and children. In the years following the Tudor period, the laws were changed during a period of time referred to as the Bloody Code, in which hundreds of new offences carried the death sentence. To put people off committing these offences, Many executions of even minors were carried out, but Alice Glaston is considered the youngest girl on record to have been legally executed in England. There was a boy who was allegedly hanged for arson, named John Dean, who was condemned at the age of around 9, but Alice Glaston is the youngest girl to be executed. It was said in the records that in the small market town of Much Wenlock, alongside 2 other criminals, Alice was hanged in front of a crowd that had assembled, but how and why did this young girl face the hangman's noose and the gallows? The parish register and records written by the vicar of Much Wenlock from 1545 states that here was buried John Dodd of the parish of Little Wenlock, who was hanged here, as also Alice Glaston, 11 years of age, of the parish of Little Wenlock, and William Harper, a tailor. With this, it isn't specifically stated that the 3 were executed for the same crime, but as Much Wenlock was a small settlement, it must be assumed that this could be the case. 3 executions occurred at the same time inside of the small town, and it's likely that an executioner was summoned from a bigger settlement nearby to perform the killings. But court records do not exist and have been lost to time, and because of this it's not completely clear what Alice did. She was probably tried at the Wenlock Guildhall, which was a town hall and also a local courtroom, where judges would preside over cases. These were built 5 years before the execution, as when Henry VIII dissolved a priory nearby, the court cases needed to be heard somewhere else. On the ground floor of the Guildhall was a prison, and Alice would have been held here inside a small cell for a while. Her story is incredibly sad, but during the Tudor times, there are a number of serious offences that Alice could have been killed for. As she was a female, hanging was a standard death sentence, a method for crimes such as treason for women, as treason in men was dealt with by hanging, drawing and quartering, which was considered a much more savage and sadistic ordeal. But it's unlikely that an 11-year-old girl would have been executed for treason against King Henry VIII. He was very much a paranoid monarch and king, but it's unlikely that he would even order this, especially as the matter was dealt with in the local area and not within London. If it was a threat against the king, Alice would have been taken to London to stand trial, and then would have faced execution probably at Tyburn. Murder was a crime which was dealt with by hanging, and women who had murdered others were hanged for this. Also, theft and arson were 2 crimes deemed very serious that did carry the death penalty, but petty thieves were dealt with differently, as they were sometimes imprisoned also. Thieves who were found guilty of stealing less than a shilling would be punished in public and were whipped and also branded with hot irons. Many more were locked away inside of the stocks or the pillory, and this punishment was deemed enough. The fact if she was deemed a heretic she would have been liable to be burned at the stake also rules out that Alice Glaston was found guilty of religious crimes or being a heretic. But as Alice was sentenced to death straight away, it shows that what she must have done must have been very serious. It's possible that alongside the 2 men she was executed with, that she could have been involved in a murder or the death of someone else, or could have been guilty of arson. There are no other records of burials of young children at the time connected to Alice's story, so it's unlikely that she murdered another child. But what is hugely concerning is that Alice Glaston, the young 11-year-old girl, could have been executed after someone may have accused her of being a witch. At this time, many women found themselves accused of witchcraft, and with this they were forced to defend themselves under immense pressure from the men and people who were accusing them, and they were also forced to fight for their lives in front of the judge. Some women were even thrown into lakes and rivers, and were weighed down as they were deemed witches, but Alice Glaston could have been sentenced to death, as she may have been accused of being involved in the dark arts. During Henry VIII's reign, this was a common fear, and locals were very scared of women who were accused of witchcraft, and often trials and executions got carried away with, and women were not given a chance to defend themselves. But what is shocking is that a crowd would have gathered to see the execution of the young 11-year-old Alice Glaston, which shows you how brutal Tudor society really was. Tudor England was a terrifying and scary place, which believed it was right to sentence a young child to death. It's a time where Henry VIII executed around 70,000 people during his reign, but of these, Alice Glaston's death has to be considered as one of the most shocking of the Tudor period, and almost as shocking as Anne Boleyn's death. She is a forgotten victim of the time period, but at the time the age of criminal responsibility was just 7, meaning that someone aged 7 could be held accountable for their actions and any crimes that they may have committed. But inside of Much Wenlock, on that dark day, Alice Glaston, the 11-year-old girl, became the child victim of King Henry VIII and King Henry VIII's laws. Thomas Cromwell was born around 1485 in Putney, near to the River Thames, west of the City of London. He was the youngest of 3 children, and his father was a blacksmith and brewer. His father was rather cruel, and he often got into trouble with the law and authorities. In 1503, at the age of 18, Cromwell left England to go to Europe, and he joined the French army as a mercenary soldier, but he did not like life in the army. He left and was then employed in Italy, inside of the house of a merchant. But in Florence, Cromwell was influenced by the culture, and his master was regularly visited by Renaissance scholars and artists such as Michelangelo. He came back to England around 1512, and he began to establish himself as a merchant in London. Cromwell wasn't happy settling for one job, and he also began to practice law. It was his career as a lawyer that would see him become familiar with King Henry VIII. In 1514, he married Elizabeth Williams, and the couple had at least 3 children and lived inside the City of London. They were a thriving family, and their marriage was peaceful and settled, but tragedy did hit them. Within the space of a year, Cromwell lost his wife and daughters to sickness, and he never remarried. He was rising throughout London heavily, and he was a successful businessman. Cardinal Wolsey, who was the chief minister of Henry VIII at the time, supported Cromwell, and together the two became very close. Wolsey was the most powerful man besides the king in England. Cromwell became one of Wolsey's most trusted servants and advisers, and he was involved at the time in dissolving smaller religious houses to pay for a new college at Oxford. During this time, Cromwell learned the financial strength which could be gained from dissolving monastic buildings, and he would do exactly the same for the king. Throughout his time in power, Cromwell had a number of enemies at court who strongly disliked him. Henry VIII at the time had tried to get out of his first marriage with Catherine of Aragon. The king's great matter plagued Henry, as the Pope would not grant an annulment. This led to Wolsey becoming embroiled in the conflict between the king and the Pope, and Wolsey was used to try and obtain a divorce or an annulment. Wolsey regarded Cromwell as his beloved, and the pair were very close, but while serving Wolsey, Henry VIII began to notice Cromwell, and the king was impressed with his loyalty and intelligence. Cromwell began to work for the king, providing legal expertise with regards to getting the king out of his marriage. Whilst working on this, he became very close to the king and also the Queen-to-be, Anne Boleyn. He became a key ally to the couple, and he rose to power very quickly. In April 1532, he became the Master of the Jewels, which were kept at the Tower of London, and he received many other roles. His annual income in today's money was around £4 million, which shows you how wealthy Cromwell really was. He was placed in charge of dissolving the monasteries across England. Henry eventually got what he wanted with the annulment in May 1533, and Anne Boleyn was later crowned in June 1533. Henry broke from the Catholic Church to do this, and declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. This meant it was he who was the head of the Church and not the Pope. In this era of change, Cromwell took on his biggest task, dissolving the monasteries and absorbing their riches into the royal coffers. The monasteries were some of the wealthiest institutions across England, and their riches were stolen and sold to fund the king's lifestyle and wars. Thousands of monks and servants found themselves homeless and jobless as Cromwell sent in his group of advisers to close down the monastic buildings. There was outrage about this, and opposition in the form of the protests of Pilgrimage of Grace. The North rose up to demand that the change was reverted, but this never occurred. From the seizure of land, the king became incredibly rich, seizing land, gold, silver, and much more wealth. A number of priests and monks who opposed were even thrown into prison and were also executed for their opposition. Those who refused to accept the king's supremacy and Anne Boleyn's queenship were also executed, including the very highly thought of Sir Thomas More. But with Anne Boleyn not being able to provide Henry with a male heir, the king's eye wandered yet again, and it was clear that Henry needed a way out of his marriage to Anne Boleyn. Cromwell created an intricate web of lies based on treason, incest and adultery The saw Anne accused of these charges with 5 other men, including her own brother. Anne was then taken to the Tower of London, placed on trial, and later beheaded inside of the tower's walls by French swordsmen on the 19th of May 1536. Cromwell was even there to witness the execution, but following Anne's death, he allied himself with Jane Seymour, but cracks were appearing between him and the king. The changes brought about by Cromwell saw him become a target for his enemies, and following Jane Seymour's death, after giving birth to Edward VI, Cromwell's demise came. After the king had lost his 3rd wife, Cromwell was tasked with finding wife number 4 for Henry. He proposed one of the Cleves daughters, German princesses, for a match to establish a powerful European alliance. Henry dispatched Hans Holbein, his painter, to create lifelike images of Amalia of Cleves and Anne of Cleves, and when he returned, Henry, looking at the images, chose Anne. But when Henry saw her when she came to England in December 1539, Henry was greatly upset. He screamed at Cromwell that she was nothing like the pictures, and their marriage, which had been arranged, was a sham. Henry searched greatly for a way out, but he had to go through with it, but the marriage was not consummated. Henry later annulled his 4th marriage, and was forced to give Anne a significant amount of land and houses, which cost him greatly. But Cromwell's enemies then stuck their claws in. He was made the Earl of Essex, but his enemies were outraged by this, and they spread rumours about Cromwell rebelling against the king. Henry at the time was incredibly paranoid, and ordered the arrest of his chief minister, and Cromwell was accused of heresy and treason. He was held inside the Tower of London, and his enemies humiliated him and tore off the Order of the Garter. He was declared a traitor, and Cromwell, who was one of the best lawyers in England, was backed to find himself a way out. But his enemies avoided a trial and didn't dare risk putting him on trial. They thought he would be able to get himself off the charges, and they convinced the king to pass a bill of attainder. This outlined the crimes Cromwell was accused of, and he was condemned to die without the need for a trial. There was only one way for him to escape execution, and it was if Henry pardoned him. Whilst being held in the Tower, he wrote several times to his former friend, and begged the king for forgiveness and to spare him. One letter said, "Written at the Tower this Wednesday the last of June, with the heavy heart and trembling hand of your Highness's most heavy, most miserable prisoner, and poor slave. Most gracious Price, I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy." Henry did nothing, except to commute his death sentence from being hanged, drawn and quartered to a more straightforward beheading. On the 28th of July 1540, Cromwell was walked the short journey out of the Tower of London to Tower Hill, the site of his execution. He was flanked by guards and the crowds who came to see his downfall. He arrived and climbed the scaffold and spoke out to the huge crowd that had assembled. He said, "I am come hither to die, and not to purge myself, as some think peradventure that I will." He then stated he had offended God and the king, and he asked for the forgiveness of them both. He then said, "I die in the Catholic faith, not doubting in many article of my faith, nor in any sacrament of the church." When he said this, he did this as humour, as he had caused such damage, destroying parts of the Catholic faith in England forever, with his brutal policies. Cromwell continued to maintain his innocence, and he continued to say, "Many have slandered me, and reported that I have been a bearer of such as I have maintained evil opinions, which is untrue, but I confess that like as God by his Holy Spirit doth instruct us in the truth, so the devil is ready to seduce us, and I have been seduced." He then committed his soul to Jesus, calling on his mercy, saying, "I see and acknowledge that there is in myself no hope of salvation, but all my confidence, hope and trust is in thy merciful goodness." He then went on to commit his faith, and denied aiding any heretics, which protected his family from any further punishment. It's debated what happened next with his execution. Some accounts state how the executioner had a significant amount of difficulty separating his head from his body, but other accounts say Cromwell's head was taken clean off. Those who stated it took more than one blow argue that it took 3 to take his head off, with the executioner butchering the job. The account of the botched execution states that Cromwell so patiently suffered the strong of the axe by a ragged and butchery miser, who very ungodly performed his office. There was rumours that his enemies paid the executioner to do a bad job, as they knew it would inflict more suffering to Cromwell. After his beheading, His head was placed on a spike above London Bridge. Following Cromwell's execution, the king greatly regretted everything that happened around the scandal. Cromwell's life and legacy impacted thousands, and it is still felt today. Henry's regret for the execution of his chief minister tells us that the scandal around his marriage to Anne of Cleves was very regretful. But Cromwell today is considered one of the most powerful men in Tudor society. He is a villain in the eyes of many, and a man who it's deemed had the king's back no matter what.
The burnings of people during Mary I's reign occurred all over the country. In cities and towns such as Lewes and Canterbury, there were many people burned for their religious beliefs. The persecutions were wide-reaching across the nation, and some of the most high-profile executed were Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and also Bishops Latimer and Ridley. The execution method of burning was linked to heresy and religious crimes, and it was a standard way of dealing with heretics who had been condemned to death. Crowds would flock to see these killings, despite how savage they were, and places such as Smithfield became an infamous site of execution because of it. Many executions were carried out on market days, where more people would be around to see the proceedings, and the point of these burnings was also to put people off being Protestant, and to get them to assimilate to Mary I's Catholic beliefs. But on Guernsey, there was a family which was destroyed by the Marian persecutions. Guillemine Gilbert and Peratine Massey were sisters, and on the island they lived with their mother named Catherine Courches. Peratine was married to a Norman Calvinist minister who left the island to go to London, it's believed to avoid persecution and punishment on Guernsey for not being a Catholic priest. However, during some of the accusations levelled against the three women, they were initially accused of having been given a stolen goblet. Handling stolen property was seen as a serious crime at the time, and Peratine Massey, Guillemine Gilbert, and Catherine Courches were sent to trial. At their trial it was decided that a man named Vincent Gosset, who was the main witness, had lied about this, and the women were found not guilty, and Gosset was actually punished with his ears being nailed to the pillory. During the trial it was also discovered, though, that the three women had not been attending church. This was a very serious thing to do during the Tudor times, and many people became known as recusants, who refused to go to church, and they were punished through fines and then execution. This even occurred during Mary I's reign and after it, and the court report on the three women stated that, "Master Dean and justices in your court and jurisdiction, after all amiable recommendations, pleaseth you to know that we are informed by the depositions of certain honest men, passed before us in manner of an inquiry, in the which inquiry Catherine Courches and her two daughters have submitted themselves in a certain matter criminal, wherein we be informed that they have been disobedient to the commandments and ordinances of the Church, in contemning and forsaking the Mass and the ordinances of the same, against the will and commandment of our sovereign Lord, the King and the Queen." Because of this, all of the women were then tried for heresy on the 4th of July 1556. Peratine Massey, Guillemine Gilbert and Catherine Courches claimed they'd been acting in the religious policies of the previous king, King Edward VI. Their neighbours stated that they were not willing to accept Mary I's ideas on religion and her church services, as in Catholic Mass. Because of this, the three women were then found guilty of heresy and were then sentenced to death to be burned at the stake in a horrific ordeal. But at the time, Peratine Massey was pregnant, and even back to the pagan times, it was said that pregnant women could not be executed or killed by burning at the stake. But Catholics during the Tudor period believed that this was an acceptable thing to do, to kill the child as well as the mother, even if they had not been born. Helier Gosselin was the man placed in charge of the execution that occurred on Guernsey on the 18th of July 1556. The three women, the two sisters and mother, were all brought to the stake in their execution site. They were all burned on the same fire, and a court official read out their death sentence. John Fox said of the executions of the three women, "The time then being come, when these three good servants and holy saints of God, the innocent mother with her two daughters, should suffer, in the place where they should consummate their martyrdom, were three stakes set up. At the middle post was the mother, the eldest daughter on the right hand, the youngest on the other. They were first strangled, but the rope broke before they were dead, and so the poor women fell in the fire. Peretin, who was great with child, did fall on her side, where happened a rueful sight, not only to the eyes of all that stood there, but also to the ears of all true-hearted Christians that shall read this history. For as the belly of the woman burst asunder by the vehemence of the flame. With this Fox outlined that the three were all burned together on one fire, and that they were supposed to be strangled first, so they were all dead before the fire killed them. But this did not happen, and they were all burned alive. Fox accused that Peretin's stomach then burst open with the fire. Another witness commented on this brutal part of the execution. One witness stated that the baby was taken from the fire and was then laid on the grass nearby, before an executioner ordered that it should be carried back to the fire and burned alongside its mother. Fox stated that, and so the infant, baptized in his own blood, to fill up the number of God's innocent saints, was both born and died a martyr, leaving behind to the world, which it never saw, a spectacle wherein the whole world may see the heralding cruelty of Catholic tormentors. As the dead mother's uncle later complained in one of the surviving records of the incident, the baby born of one of them being taken and cast up in the fire again, 4 were executed, though only 3 had been condemned. It's believed that if Peretin Massey had declared in court that she was pregnant before her execution, then it may have been postponed until after she had been given birth. However, this may have still gone ahead. But today a memorial plaque of the martyrs marks the site near to their execution on the island. But during the reign of Mary I, executions like this occurred all over the land. By the time she had died, she had burned over 280 people at the stake in shocking scenes, which haunted many people across England. When Queen Elizabeth I took the crown, following Mary I's death on the 17th of November 1558, there were Protestants who had been condemned as heretics and were waiting to be burned alive. Elizabeth refused to sign their death warrants, and then had these Protestants released. The executioner who burned the women was subject to much debate, and Protestants tried to get him executed for the way he dealt with the 3 women and the fact that Peretin Massey was pregnant. But the executions of the Guernsey martyrs were some of the most shocking of Mary I's reign, and it shows the truly brutal side of Mary.
Thomas Cranmer rose to prominence during the reign of King Henry VIII, and he was involved in much of the religious changes at the time. Little is known about his early life and childhood, but he did go to Jesus College in Cambridge to study for 8 years. He married a local lady named Joan, who worked in an inn, and because of his marriage and the fact Joan was pregnant, he gave up his fellowship briefly. He then returned to Cambridge following Joan's death in childbirth, and Cranmer took holy orders in 1520, and was named as a preacher who had been given licence to preach in cities across the country. He was devoted to Catholicism and the Pope, and he went against the Reformation at the time and the ideas of Martin Luther that were emerging across Europe. He was a celebrated scholar and was personally involved in helping King Henry VIII to get his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, and it was he who stated to other prominent bishops that the king should get the opinion of scholars and theorists rather than relying on Rome and the Pope. The king liked this idea because it meant he would get the outcome he desired, and Cranmer was part of the group of men who were consulted on their opinions. They concluded that the king could do as he pleased within his own kingdom, and he could annul his marriage to Catherine without the consent and permission of Rome. Henry's power in England was ultimate, and it was also decreed that his marriage to his brother's widow was illegal and against religious law, and with this Henry VIII got what he wanted. Thomas Cranmer after this became involved in the royal court and politics, and he became an ambassador to the court of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and here he saw the effects of the Reformation across Europe. But in autumn 1532, he was summoned back to England, as it was outlined he was going to be selected as the new Archbishop of Canterbury, and he went home before being consecrated on the 30th of March 1533. Henry and Cranmer worked together to finalise the annulment, and also ensure that Henry married Anne Boleyn quickly, as she was now pregnant. A secret marriage ceremony between the king and his second wife was held in January 1553, and Cranmer later ruled that the king's first marriage was against God's will, and he declared Henry and Anne Boleyn's marriage to be the valid one. Later, Anne was crowned king, and Cranmer was also the man who baptised Henry and Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, the future Queen Elizabeth I, and Cranmer was her godfather. More success came for him within the king's inner circle, but he could not save Anne Boleyn, Henry's second wife, from falling from grace and being executed within the Tower of London. The king grew annoyed with his queen, as she could not provide him with a male heir, and Cranmer was instructed to act as a judge to rule over Henry's petition to divorce Anne Boleyn. Cranmer yet again had to help the king out of a marriage, and he needed to reverse his initial decision. It was Thomas Cromwell who ultimately set the seed of treachery against Anne, but Cranmer did nothing to save her from a brutal execution. After this he continued to work on religious reform, and he adopted the English Bible, which had been translated by Coverdale, Rogers and Tyndale. During Henry's reign, Cranmer was a key advisor and was succeeding, being considered a popular figure, but he would cross the king later on. Cranmer found out about his fifth wife Catherine Howard's illicit affair with Thomas Culpeper, one of the king's closest friends and advisors. It was Cranmer who was the one who had to investigate, and he had to inform the king of his wife's affair. He did this by passing the king a letter whilst he was praying inside of the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace. Henry took Cranmer's word, and after further investigations, Catherine Howard was beheaded inside the walls of the Tower of London. There was a plot to oust Cranmer in 1543, but he had the king's full support. He had been arrested but was backed by the king, and his accusers were thrown in prison and one was executed. As Henry VIII's health failed, Cranmer was there for the final moments and was there by his bedside as the king passed away. He held his hand and gave the king a reformed statement of faith before giving him his last rites. Cranmer grieved his master and close friend, and even grew a beard because of it. He continued to serve as the Archbishop of Canterbury under Edward VI, and was an executor of Henry VIII's will, and a member of the Protectorate set up to rule for the young king. He continued the Reformation and established a Book of Common Prayer. There was a rebellion against this, and this did slightly damage his reputation, but he continued to reform the church. Following Edward's death, Cranmer was in charge at the funeral, and at the time, many of the important members of the church left England, as Mary I sought to take the throne from Lady Jane Grey. For Cranmer, things were dangerous, as Mary was a Catholic, and after all, his recent work was about making England more Protestant. He was forced to stand before the Queen's Council, and was briefly sent to the Tower of London, being accused of being a heretic, before he made it to the Mikado prison in Oxford. Whilst held here, he was forced to watch the execution and burning of Bishop Latimer Ridley. Cranmer then was stripped of his church offices and was brought to trial for heresy on the 12th of September 1555. He was forced to wait from Rome to establish his guilt, and he was removed from being the Archbishop of Canterbury, but he made a number of recantations. 4 times he apologised for his faith and work, and handed himself over to Mary and her beliefs, but Mary refused to remove the execution order. It had been said that on the 7th of March 1556 he would be killed, but as he returned to Catholicism, his execution was delayed for the 21st of March 1556. It's interesting to consider that Mary I wished still to have him killed, such was the damage he had caused to her religion. On the day of his execution, Cranmer was taken to University Church in Oxford to recant in public, but whilst giving a sermon, he renounced his recantations and said he had only signed them in falsity, and that the arm he signed these with would be burned first at the stake. He was angrily taken from the pulpit to his place of execution, where the stake had been prepared. His execution should not have gone ahead, as he did recant to his old faith, but by executing him, Mary was establishing her authority over leading Protestants, and the man who allowed the king to annul the marriage of her father and mother. Because of this, Mary had been shunned and treated poorly by Henry VIII. She believed she was doing God's work, ridding the country of a leading heretic. A large crowd had been gathered in Oxford to watch the death of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. An eyewitness account exists of the proceedings, and it tells a story of barbarism and brutality. It was said, coming to the stake with a cheerful countenance and willing mind, he put off his garments with haste, and stood upright in his shirt. A Bachelor of Divinity laboured to convert him to his former recantation, with 2 Spanish friars, and when the friars saw his constancy, they said in Latin to one another, "Let us go from him, we ought not to be nigh him, for the devil is with him." But the Bachelor of Divinity was more earnest with him, and to whom he answered that as concerning his recantation, he repented it right, because he knew it was against the truth. The Bachelor of Divinity then refused to take him by the hand, and blamed all of the others that so did, and said he was sorry that he ever came in his company, and yet again he required him to agree to his former recantation. And the bishop answered, showing his hand, "This was the hand that wrote it, and therefore shall it suffer first punishment." Recantation was still sought from Cranmer, but he continued to refuse yet again. It was then said, fire now being put to him, he stretched out his right hand and thrust it into the flame, and held it there a good space, before the fire came to any other part of his body, where his hand was seen of every man sensibly burning, crying with a loud voice, "This hand hath offended." As soon as the fire got up, he was very soon dead, never stirring or crying all the while. His patience in the torment, his courage in dying. His dying words were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. I see the heavens open, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God." The brutality of Thomas Cranmer's burning at the stake shocked those who were there that day in Oxford to witness the proceedings. He was one of the most prominent and influential members of Henry VIII's government, and in his role over the church, he was key in reforming and making England more Protestant. But he encountered a rival in Mary I, who would not be like her father, and who would punish those men and women that she deemed were attacking her religion and the church. Cranmer was seen as one of those men, and because of this, he was brutally executed at the hands of Bloody Mary. Henry VIII in his last will and testament excluded the Stuarts from succeeding to the English throne, but in the eyes of many Catholics, Elizabeth I, who came onto the throne following Mary I, was illegitimate. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, and when she married Henry, this caused chaos and forced through the English Reformation, as the Pope would not grant Henry his divorce or annulment from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Anne was later beheaded inside of the Tower of London on the King's orders, and as Elizabeth was a daughter of her, it was believed she was illegitimate and barred from the throne because of this. Catholics believed that Mary Stuart, the Scottish Queen, and also the rightful Queen of Scotland, being the most senior legitimate descendant of Henry VII, through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, was the rightful Queen of England. Mary, through her turbulent and tragic love life, was eventually driven out of Scotland, as there was much treachery and plotting against her. She had ruled for a number of years, but her second husband, Lord Darnley, was a man who wished to take power himself. He was deemed weak and with no authority, and he became jealous of Mary's closeness with her secretary David Rizzio, and then had him murdered in front of the 6-month pregnant Mary in bloody scenes. Darnley was later killed, but then she married the man who it's believed was responsible for the death of her second husband, and for this she was forced off the throne, and her son James became the King of Scotland. Mary was imprisoned in a castle in Scotland, but in May 1568 she managed to escape and flee to England. She was placed under guard by Elizabeth I when she came to England, and throughout the next 18 years of her life she was held as a prize prisoner of the English Queen, and was moved to a number of locations and castles around the country. This was done to protect her, as it was believed that Catholics would break her out of prison. Mary's presence in England gave Elizabeth a headache, as the Catholics were already unhappy with her approach to religion, and there was a genuine worry that there would be an uprising, and that Mary would be freed and would be the figurehead of a Catholic rebellion to oust or even assassinate the Protestant Queen Elizabeth. Many Catholics genuinely believed Mary should have been the Queen, and Elizabeth and her courts became very suspicious of her. Elizabeth was aware that she was the target of a number of assassination plots, and there were 3 significant ones involving Mary Queen of Scots and the death of Elizabeth. In 1571, the Ridolfi plot planned this, as did the Throckmorton plot in 1583, and then 3 years later the most significant plot to kill Elizabeth, involving Mary, would come. The Babington plot, led by Anthony Babington, planned to break Mary out of prison, and then put her on the throne of England by also assassinating Elizabeth I. Mary and Babington wrote letters to each other, discussing the plan, and Mary subsequently gave her permission for the plan to go ahead. But these letters were intercepted by Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth I's spymaster, and Mary's involvement in the plan could not be disputed. Because of this, she was technically guilty of treason, but Elizabeth was very hesitant to order the execution of her cousin and an anointed queen, especially the one whose country borders England. The problem was that Elizabeth did not really have a choice, as having Mary alive was too dangerous, even as she was held captive for almost 20 years. She could not send her into exile, or return her back to Scotland either, but eventually was convinced to sign her death warrant. Mary in the meantime was moved to Fotheringhay Castle, where she was held as the Queen's prisoner. She had been placed on trial there, being found guilty of treason, and on the 1st of February 1587, finally the death warrant was signed. On the 7th of February, a number of representatives from Queen Elizabeth arrived at Fotheringhay, where Mary was held prisoner, and they informed her of her impending execution that would take place on the next morning at between 7 and 8 o'clock. Her jailer was ordered to prepare everything for her death, and Mary, hearing this, it's believed was relieved that her years in prison and reduced freedom would come to an end. She said she had been prepared for death ever since she arrived in England and was taken prisoner. Mary had enough of her treatment, but did ask the men for some time to get her affairs in order, but then she was cut down and this was refused. It was said that Mary's execution could not be delayed a moment beyond that time. In her final hours, Mary Queen of Scots wrote to her friends and family, saying goodbye to her ladies, and also she spent some time in prayer. On the morning of the 8th of February 1587, she was summoned from her room for her execution. Inside the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, a scaffold had been created that was covered in black cloth. It was reached by a couple of small steps, and on the scaffold was a block, and a cushion for Mary to kneel on as she lay her head on it. There were also 3 stools, one for her and the Earls of Shrewsbury and Kent, who were sent to watch the execution. Mary, when she entered Fotheringhay's great hall, entered full of majesty and grace, as if she was attending a ball or dance, and not her own death. As she got close to the scaffold, she asked for help climbing up the stairs, and then she asked officers to allow her priest to remain with her, but this was refused. She was offered a Protestant minister, but this was seen by Mary as a final insult to her wishes and her faith. She was advised to carry the cross of Christ in her heart rather than in her hand, and she prayed that England and Scotland would be converted to the Catholic Church once more. Mary then summoned her ladies-in-waiting to help her prepare for her final moments. She had her ladies remove her black veil, her headdress and other jewellery. The executioner tried to help, but Mary raged, forcing the man back, saying that he could not touch her. When Mary's ladies helped her, they revealed that she was wearing a velvet petticoat and sleeves of crimson brown, the colour that symbolised she would become a Catholic martyr. Her executioner, a man named Bull, and his assistant, as was customary, then begged for Mary's forgiveness, and the Queen granted him this, and she hoped that any sins she had would be forgiven by God. She wore a golden crucifix, which was allegedly made from wood from the true cross, and she wished to give this to one of her ladies, but the executioner prevented this. She then told her ladies to go, and made the sign of the cross to them. They were all distressed, and one in particular burst into tears, but Mary reassured her, and then they were told to go and pray for Mary's soul. Jane Kennedy, one of her ladies, then gave the Queen of Scots a white handkerchief and blindfolded Mary. She then briskly knelt down at the block and said, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend thy spirit," in Latin, and then Mary stretched out her arms, giving the executioner the sign that she was ready to die. Mary's execution did not go as planned. Inside of the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, the executioner made a mess of Mary's death. She was not beheaded with one strike of the axe. The first blow came crushing down from the axe and missed her neck, and instead struck the back of her head, causing a terrible wound to her skull. The second strike from the axe almost severed her neck completely, apart from a small piece of sinew that held her head still to her body. Following this, the executioner then cut through the sinew like a saw with his axe, and he then held Mary Queen of Scots' head to the crowd. As he held it up, he said, "God save the Queen," but Mary's auburn hair he was holding was in fact a wig. With this, Mary's head fell from the air onto the floor, with the executioner holding the wig. It was said that Mary actually had very short grey hair, and her head rolled towards the edge of the scaffold. It was noted that her lips stirred up and down for a quarter of an hour after her head was cut off. After the beheading of Mary, anything that belonged to the Queen or was touched by her was burned inside the fireplace of the Great Hall, to prevent any relics being collected from her. After hearing that the execution had gone ahead, Elizabeth I was raging and furious, and she greatly regretted the death of Mary until the day she died. Mary's body was embalmed and left in a lead coffin before being buried in a Protestant service inside of Peterborough Cathedral. The Protestant service would have been against Mary's wishes, but her body was later exhumed and reinterred during the reign of her son as King of England and Scotland, and it was placed in Westminster Abbey, opposite the tomb of Elizabeth I. The execution of Mary Queen of Scots was a botched one, in which the executioner performed his office poorly. The event was very shocking, as one queen had ordered the death and signed off on the execution of another anointed queen. In a time in which many people believed that monarchs were sent by God to rule, this was seen as Elizabeth executing someone sent by God to rule over people. But what was clear was the fact that Mary did in fact comply with plots to break her out of prison, and agreed to plots to overthrow Elizabeth. Yes, this is treason, but it's believed because of the desperation and frustration she had being imprisoned for almost 2 decades that Mary complied with this. Mary Queen of Scots was probably desperate to secure her freedom, something of which Elizabeth I would never grant her. The English Reformation changed religion across the country for centuries. Henry VIII broke from the Roman Catholic Church after being forced to, as the Pope would not grant his divorce. Scholars would advise the king that he should not have to answer to anyone in matters regarding his kingdom, and Henry decided to go through with the change. He became the supreme head of the Church of England, and with this it ushered in a great time of turmoil with regards to religion, as subsequent monarchs would bring in a huge number of religious reforms that would leave many people confused and liable to punishment. Henry VIII, for example, even executed some of his closest friends, such as Sir Thomas More, for not accepting his supremacy over the Church, and Mary I would change the religion of the country from Protestantism under Henry and Edward VI back to Catholicism, leaving people shocked, not knowing what to believe or how to worship. It was in this era of religious persecution that Margaret Clitheroe, a normal woman inside of York, would be sentenced to death. Margaret Clitheroe was born in 1556 and was the daughter of the Sheriff of York and the churchwarden of St Martin's Church, found on Coney Street in the city. The church is still there today, but as a young girl Margaret was a Protestant, but in the 1570s she became converted to Catholicism by the wife of a prominent young Catholic doctor. Around the time of her conversion, Margaret married John Clitheroe, who was a very known figure inside of York. John was a popular butcher who opened a shop inside the heart of the city, on the historic street of the Shambles. Each day hundreds of people would walk by his shop, and he had a number of different customers, so the Clitheroes were a feature of York City life. Despite being a butcher, John Clitheroe was also responsible for reporting Catholic worshippers to the authorities as part of Elizabeth I's religious settlement. For Elizabeth I, she needed to bring in a form of compromise with regards to religious worship, and she hoped to bring a fair solution for both Protestants and Catholics, but her ideas did little to cure the animosity. The Queen herself would be subject to a number of different plots wrapped in religion that would hope to bring about her death and overthrow her from the throne in favour of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. The 1570s and 80s were in particular very dangerous for her, and she had a spy network set up to uncover different plots and plans against her. John Clitheroe was trusted with reporting Catholic worshippers, and they were in particular persecuted and treated poorly at the time. He would have known about his wife Margaret's beliefs, and this would have stressed the couple out. John was in charge of telling on Catholics, yet he was married to one. Margaret began to take things further, and she became a recusant who refused to attend church services, which was considered a great crime. The punishment for this was a number of fines, and Margaret's husband John would have to pay the financial penalty of 12 pence for his wife's indiscretions and refusal to attend Church of England services. Margaret Clitheroe was first imprisoned in 1577 for refusal to attend, and then was imprisoned twice more at York Castle for the same crime. She was a persistent offender, and her final imprisonment was for around 2 years. Whilst in prison, she learned how to read Latin, so she could deliver Latin Mass, which at the time was banned in the settlement. Margaret also found out about a number of persecutions of Catholics across the country, and she was moved by this. She decided to go on pilgrimage to the gallows of Tyburn, where a number of Catholic priests had been hanged for their beliefs. It was clear as time was going on, Margaret Clitheroe was becoming more ardent a Catholic. She had escaped death a number of times for her religious views, and many Catholics across the country were fleeing to Europe, or were being sentenced to death and were being imprisoned for their beliefs. But Margaret went further still. She became involved in hiding and shielding Catholic priests and key Catholic figures. This was a crime which was punishable by death, and during this time many noble families had priest holes built into their houses where priests could be hidden if the authorities came. Many of these can still be seen today, and this was a rather effective way of hiding underground Catholic worship, in which suspicion wasn't aroused if the wealthier family had enough money to shield Catholic priests. Clitheroe, though, began to shield priests not in wealthy stately homes or castles, but inside of her own home on the Shambles, in the bustling heart of the city of York. Her husband, remember, was tasked with telling on Catholics, but under his nose she made a secret hidden wall in her home on the Shambles, using a secret cupboard. Here she hid priest vestments and wine and bread for Catholic Mass, which was also banned under the settlement. If someone was found hiding these, they could be sentenced to death. But unfortunately for Margaret, a young boy who found these items gave up the location to the authorities, and in March 1586 the Clitheroe home was raided. It was said that Margaret also had 2 other chambers where she hid items, and that she rented a house nearby where priests were also hidden. She was arrested for harbouring Catholic officials, and the sentence of this crime was sometimes death. Margaret was brought to trial, and was brought to the York Assize Courts. At trial she refused to give over any innocent or guilty plea, and this prevented a trial taking place, but also prevented her 3 children from being implicated and being forced to testify either for her or against her. By doing this she protected her children from torture or being forced to speak out against their own mother, and the judge tried desperately to get a plea from her, but Margaret continued to refuse. She claimed that she had committed no such crime, and that Catholicism was the true religion, and that she wished to become a Catholic martyr rather than to conform to Protestantism and the new Church of England teachings. She was very brave and had also made up her mind, and she made sure her friends and husband were not implicated in her actions. But what happened next was incredibly brutal for Margaret Clitheroe. At the time of her death, it's claimed that she was in fact pregnant with her 4th child. She was led to her death and execution on the 25th of March 1586, and her method of execution was pressing. It was incredibly savage, and she was taken to the toll booth on the Usa Bridge. Along with Clitheroe, her own door was brought, and she would be crushed to death by this in an attempt to force a plea. Margaret, who it's believed was pregnant, was stripped and then forced to lie over a sharp rock, the size of a man's fist, which jabbed into her spine and her back. A handkerchief was placed over her head, and then the heavy front door was placed on top of her. Over time, the weight of around 900 pounds was added to the door, which with the rock on her spine, caused her back to snap, breaking her spine. This was incredibly brutal, and with this it took 15 minutes of complete agony for Margaret Clitheroe to die, whilst the people of York watched her slow last gasps of air. She would have been screaming, such was the agony, and her body was then disgustingly left out for 6 hours before the weight was taken off, with her remains being a mangled state. After her shocking death, one of her children would leave England to train as a Catholic priest and a missionary, but the death of Margaret Clitheroe shocked even the Queen. With her execution, Elizabeth I condemned those who had carried out her awful fate, and blamed the fact she was a woman for her barbaric treatment. She claimed that it should never have happened, but it was her religious rules that brought about this sort of persecution. Her death shows how savage and dangerous of a time it was during the Elizabethan period, and also during the Tudor period, with regards to religion. To follow a different belief from those set out by the monarchy, could result in someone being executed. Clitheroe was not alone. There were thousands of people burned at the stake, beheaded, and killed in other brutal ways for their religious beliefs. It certainly was a very brutal and dangerous time.